The Constellation Gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art was less a party and more a carefully curated ecosystem of power. The air in the Temple of Dendur was a heady mix of Chanel No. 5, 100-year-old Scotch, and the silent, ferocious hum of ambition. Among the Egyptian artifacts and the living fossils of New York high society, Elias Vance was the apex predator. At 68, his face was a roadmap of ruthless decisions and sleepless nights. But his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, had lost none of their piercing intensity. Vance Industries was a global behemoth, its shadow touching everything from aerospace engineering to private equity. Tonight, however, the Titan felt the immense weight of his own empire. Then, in the time it took for a string quartet to slide from Vivaldi to a minor key, the axis of that universe tilted. A collective gasp, sharp and sibilant, cut through the refined chatter. Elias Vance, a man who had stared down hostile takeovers and congressional committees without flinching, swayed on his feet. His hand, clutching a glass of mineral water, went to his chest. He collapsed not with a dramatic flourish, but with the dead, final weight of a felled oak. Security surged, a wall of black suits and coiled earpieces. The city's most influential figures froze, their diamonds and dinner jackets forming a glittering, useless circle of panicked inertia. Everyone froze. Everyone except a girl who was paid to be invisible. What Clara Mae Thompson did in the next 7 minutes would not only restart a man's heart, it would detonate a corporate dynasty and unearth a secret that had poisoned a small American town for 3 decades. The air in the Sackler wing was thick with privilege, a climate so rarefied it seemed to require a different kind of breathing. For Clara, it was just another shift. At 24, her life was a world away from this, a cramped walk-up in Astoria, a stack of overdue bills, and the constant, low-grade thrum of anxiety for her grandmother, Eleanor. Clara was supposed to be finishing her bachelor's in biology, a stepping stone to medical school. She had a gift for it, an almost intuitive understanding of the body's complex machinery. But Eleanor's illness, a creeping, insidious neurological disorder that had baffled a dozen specialists, had put that dream on indefinite hold. The experimental treatments weren't covered by insurance, and the home care was a ravenous beast that devoured every dollar she earned. So she worked. Catering gigs like this one paid the best, even if it meant being treated as a piece of mobile furniture. Her mind, however, was never still. It was a diagnostic tool, always running, always observing. While she refilled champagne flutes, she was also noting the telltale flush of rosacea on a banking magnate's cheeks, the slight hand tremor of a dowager that suggested more than just age, the dilated pupils of a tech bro clearly mixing his stimulants with his alcohol. It was a habit born of necessity, honed by years of watching her grandmother. Eleanor's condition meant that a subtle change in gait, a slight slur in her speech, a moment of confusion could be the harbinger of a serious decline. Clara had become a connoisseur of symptoms, a student of the body's subtle betrayals. Then her gaze fell on Elias Vance. He was standing near the reflecting pool, momentarily alone. His son-in-law, the sleek and predatory Julian Croft, was holding court a few feet away, but Vance seemed walled off, isolated by his own immense stature. Clara saw what no one else did. It wasn't the posture of a powerful man in repose. She saw the pallor beneath his expensive tan, a waxy grayish tint that the warm museum lighting couldn't hide. She saw the thin sheen of sweat on his upper lip, a diaphoresis completely at odds with the room's cool temperature. He brought a hand to his jaw, rubbing it absently, a gesture that 99% of the room would ignore. But Clara's internal alarm, the one calibrated by years of fearful vigilance over her grandmother, began to scream. Jaw pain, diaphoresis, pallor. It was the textbook triad. A myocardial infarction wasn't just a possibility, it was a statistical probability unfolding in real time. She hesitated, her training and her station at war with each other. Her manager, a pinched-faced woman named Sylvie, had been brutally clear in their briefing. You are not people tonight, you are functions. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not make eye contact. You are ghosts who serve canapes. Approaching a man like Elias Vance was a fireable offense, a career-ending, blacklistable offense. But then she saw Eleanor in her mind's eye, frail in her recliner, her breath catching in her chest during a bad spell. Clara had been helpless then, able only to call 911 and pray. She would not be helpless again. She placed her tray of empty glasses on a nearby ledge with a quiet click, the sound a gavel falling on her indecision. She started moving toward him, a small, determined figure in a black and white uniform, cutting a path through a sea of oblivious wealth. Every nerve ending, every carefully memorized page of her physiology textbooks told her that the universe of power condensed in this room was about to collapse into a single critical point. For Elias Vance, the world was shrinking to a tunnel. The elegant music of the string quartet devolved into a discordant buzzing, the clinking of glasses a painful, percussive assault. The crushing pressure in his chest was no longer a vague discomfort. It was an iron band, tightening with methodical cruelty. The pain was a living thing, a fire that shot from his sternum down his left arm and up into the jaw he'd been rubbing just moments before. He tried to draw a breath, to project the aura of control that was his trademark, but his lungs refused the command. His vision dissolved into a swarm of black spots, obscuring the priceless artifacts around him. His last coherent thought was one of profound, soul-crushing irony. To die here, surrounded by the trappings of a life he had built, yet utterly, completely alone. His knees buckled. The granite floor rose up to meet him with a sickening, final thud that was horribly, shockingly loud in the opulent space. A nearby table rattled, and a single delicate flower arrangement of white orchids toppled over, scattering petals across his still form like a premature funeral rite. A moment of stunned silence, and then pandemonium. A woman's scream, high and theatrical. A wave of guests surged forward, a morbid tide of silk and curiosity. The blue glow of 100 smartphones rose like malevolent will-o'-the-wisps, cameras activated to capture the fall of a king. "Give him air! Is he breathing? Somebody call a doctor." The cries were frantic and useless. Julian Croft, his son-in-law and the heir apparent to the Vance empire, stood frozen, his handsome face a mask of calculated shock, his mind already churning with the implications. His security detail, men trained to stop assassins, formed a tight, protective, and medically ignorant circle around their fallen boss. Clara didn't push through the crowd. She slipped through the gaps, her voice cutting through the noise with an authority that stunned even herself. "Let me through. I need to get through now." The crowd, startled by the sheer command in the voice of a mere waitress, parted for her. She fell to her knees beside Elias, the cold stone a shock through the thin fabric of her trousers. The chaos of the room, the glittering gowns, her soon-to-be-lost job, it all melted away. There was only the man on the floor and the relentless, silent ticking of a clock measuring the death of brain cells. Her fingers, nimble and sure, went straight to his carotid artery, pressing into the hollow of his neck. She held her breath, her own heart hammering against her ribs. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing. A complete absence of the familiar thrum of life. Her eyes darted to his chest. No rise, no fall. "He's in cardiac arrest," she announced, her voice ringing out, clear and devoid of panic. "His heart has stopped. We need an AED. Now. Is there an automated external defibrillator on site?" She looked up, locking eyes with the lead security guard, a burly man whose face was pale with shock. "It's in a case on the wall, usually near the fire extinguishers. It'll be marked. Go." The guard, jolted into action by her specific, confident command, began barking into his radio. Another guard looked down at her, bewildered. "Who are you?" "That doesn't matter," she snapped, her hands already moving. She tore at Elias's starched tuxedo shirt, the pearl buttons scattering across the floor like tiny, useless teeth. With a grunt of effort, she ripped the fabric open to expose his chest. She interlaced her fingers, placed the heel of her hand on his sternum, locked her elbows and began compressions. 1, and 2, and 3, and 4. She counted aloud, her voice a steady metronome in the panicked room. Her rhythm was perfect, her depth precise. This was not the gentle CPR of television dramas. It was brutal, violent work. The force required was immense, and she could feel the faint, horrifying give of his cartilage, a necessary trauma she'd been taught to expect. Sweat beaded on her forehead and dripped into her eyes, but she didn't stop. The crowd watched, mesmerized. The invisible girl was now the center of everything, her face a mask of fierce concentration as she rhythmically pounded on the chest of one of the world's wealthiest men. Julian Croft watched, his expression unreadable, a cold flicker of calculation in his eyes. A tragedy, yes, but also an opportunity. Got it. The first security guard skidded to a halt beside her, thrusting a red plastic case into her hands. Clara didn't miss a single compression. With one hand, she flipped the latches and tore open the case, pulling out the defibrillator pads. Her movements were a blur of efficiency. She ripped open the packaging with her teeth, slapping one pad onto Elias's upper right chest and the other on his lower left side, just as the diagram indicated. "Everybody stand back," she commanded, her voice raw. A calm, robotic female voice issued from the machine. "Analyzing heart rhythm. Do not touch the patient." The seconds stretched into an eternity. The entire Met held its breath. Clara's gaze was fixed on Elias's ashen face. For a brief, strange moment, he wasn't a billionaire. He was just a man, fragile and perilously close to the edge, the deep lines of stress around his eyes telling a story of a life lived under unbearable pressure. "Shock advised. Charging. Stand clear of patient." A high-pitched whine filled the air, escalating in tone. "Clear!" Clara yelled, pulling her hands back, hovering inches above his chest. The machine discharged. Elias's body arched violently off the floor in a single galvanic convulsion, then fell back with a limp finality. Her fingers were instantly back on his neck. Searching, waiting, still nothing, no pulse. "Resuming compressions," she stated, her voice tight with exertion and a rising tide of desperation. She threw her entire body weight back into the rhythmic pumping, her muscles screaming in protest, her own heart aching with the effort. The world had shrunk to this single, desperate task, forcing a beat back into a silent heart. Just as her arms began to tremble uncontrollably, she heard it, the distant rising wail of sirens, growing closer. The paramedics were coming, but she knew with the chilling certainty of a medical student that for Elias Vance, these minutes she was fighting for, these brutal, violent, desperate seconds, were the only ones that would ever matter. The arrival of the paramedics was an organized storm of efficiency. They moved with a practiced urgency that made the gawking paralysis of the Gala guests seem even more pathetic. Exhausted, trembling with adrenaline, Clara relinquished her position, delivering a crisp clinical report that would have made her anatomy professor proud. Male, late 60s, witnessed collapse, syncopal episode. No pulse or respiration on my arrival. Found him in V-fib. One shock delivered by AED, no conversion. Began CPR immediately, approximately 7 minutes of continuous compressions. The lead paramedic, a weary-looking woman with kind eyes, gave Clara a single, sharp nod of profound respect. "Good job, kid. You just gave him a fighting chance." As they loaded Elias onto a gurney, his face now obscured by an oxygen mask, the protective bubble of clinical focus that had surrounded Clara finally popped. The noise and the chaos of the room rushed back in. The whispers, the clicking phone cameras, the dawning horror of her own situation. She was suddenly acutely aware of her appearance, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, her cheap uniform blouse torn open, a small smear of blood on her knuckles from the force of the compressions. Her manager, Sylvie, descended on her like a vulture. "What in God's name do you think you were doing?" she hissed, her face a knot of pure fury. "You assaulted a guest. You destroyed a custom tuxedo. You're fired, Thompson. Get your things. You are done." I was saving his life," Clara stammered, the injustice of it a fresh blow. Before she could protest further, a swarm of reporters who had slipped past security in the chaos engulfed her. Microphones and phones were shoved in her face. "What's your name? Are you a doctor? How do you know Mr. Vance?" The questions were a dizzying, overwhelming assault. Panic seized her. Muttering, "I have to go," she pushed through the throng and fled, finding a service exit and bursting out into the cool, damp night air. She leaned against the cold stone of the museum, the wail of the ambulance fading into the Manhattan traffic, and gasped for breath. Fired. She had just saved a man from certain death, and she was fired. The sheer, breathtaking absurdity of it all threatened to swallow her whole. The next 48 hours were a surreal fever dream. Her face, captured in grainy, shaky cell phone videos, was plastered across every news channel and social media feed. The media, with their insatiable hunger for a narrative, had dubbed her the Angel of the Met. Reporters camped outside her Astoria apartment building, turning her life into a public spectacle. She stayed inside, blinds drawn, phone silenced, feeling less like a hero and more like a fugitive. On the third day, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed on her door. Peeking through the peephole, she saw a man in a severe, dark gray suit. He looked less like a journalist and more like an undertaker. Warily, she opened the door a few inches. "Miss Clara May Thompson?" he asked. His voice was deep, calm, and carried an unnerving weight of authority. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am Mr. Vance's personal counsel. May I have a moment?" She let him in reluctantly. Her small apartment, with its stacks of textbooks and secondhand furniture, seemed to shrink in the presence of his quiet, expensive power. "Mr. Vance is stable," Thorne began, foregoing pleasantries. His expression was professionally grave. "He is in the cardiac ICU at Mount Sinai, but his doctors are unequivocal. Your immediate and, I quote, perfectly executed CPR prevented any significant anoxic brain injury. You did more than save his life, Miss Thompson. You saved him." A wave of relief so profound it made her knees weak washed over Clara. I'm glad to hear that. "Mr. Vance is not a man who tolerates debts," Thorne continued, his voice neutral. "He has instructed me, from his hospital bed, to rectify your situation and express his gratitude. He has authorized me to make an offer." He placed a slim, elegant leather portfolio on her worn coffee table. Clara stared at it, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She knew what this was. This was a transaction, a payment for services rendered, a way to neatly package the messiness of his public mortality and make it go away. "He is aware you were dismissed from your position. He has arranged for a severance package from the catering company equivalent to 5 years' salary," Thorne stated, his eyes watching her reaction closely. "Furthermore, he has established a trust in your name. He is prepared to pay off any and all of your outstanding student and family medical debt. The remaining principal in the trust will be $5 million. Clara heard the words, but they didn't compute. $5 million. It was an astronomical, life-altering sum. It was a number that could solve every single problem that kept her awake at night. It could pay for a private suite for Eleanor, the best specialists in the world, experimental treatments that were currently science fiction to her. It could send her to Johns Hopkins, debt-free. It could buy her a life she couldn't even begin to imagine. But as she stared at the portfolio, a cold, sickening familiarity began to creep up her spine. It was the name, Vance Industries. For years, her small town of Northwood, Pennsylvania, had been locked in a quiet, hopeless struggle, a place where clusters of rare cancers and neurological disorders bloomed like toxic algae in a stagnant pond. Local activists and a handful of underfunded lawyers had long pointed the finger at one source, a chemical plant on the edge of town that had manufactured industrial solvents for decades. A plant that had been shut down in the late 90s, but whose legacy seeped into the groundwater, into the soil, into the very air. She had spent countless nights online, falling down rabbit holes of old EPA reports and class action lawsuit filings, trying to find a reason for what was happening to Eleanor, to her neighbors. She knew the name of that plant, the one that had been quietly bought out by a larger conglomerate just before the full extent of the environmental disaster became public knowledge. She looked Marcus Thorne directly in the eye, her voice barely a whisper. "Vance Industries," she said, the name tasting like rust in her mouth. "About 25 years ago, did they acquire a subsidiary called Chempro Solutions out of Northwood, Pennsylvania?" For the first time, Thorne's professional mask slipped. It was a flicker, a fractional widening of the eyes, but it was there. He was a world-class lawyer, trained to be impregnable, but in that split second she saw it. recognition. That was a minor acquisition, he said, his voice regaining its cautious, measured tone. Part of a larger portfolio consolidation from that era. The floor dropped out from under Clara. The air left her lungs. The man whose life she had saved. The man now offering her a king's ransom. He was the architect of her family's ruin. The owner of the very company whose chemical plume was, according to the one doctor who'd been willing to speak off the record, the most likely cause of the unique nerve degradation that was stealing her grandmother's life. This wasn't gratitude. It was a cosmic punchline of unimaginable cruelty. This was blood money, delivered in a calfskin folder. She pushed the portfolio back across the table, her hands shaking with a sudden, violent surge of grief and rage. "No," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I can't take this." Marcus Thorne stared at her, genuinely baffled. This was not a reaction he had prepared for. He had anticipated tears of joy, grateful acceptance, perhaps a bit of negotiation. He had not anticipated this. "Miss Thompson, I believe you may be misunderstanding." "Oh, I understand perfectly," she interrupted, standing up, her small frame radiating a fierce energy that seemed to make the room smaller. "You can go back to Mr. Vance. You can tell him to keep his money. You tell him I don't accept payment from the man who poisoned my grandmother." The antiseptic smell of Eleanor's apartment was the scent of Clara's guilt. It was a clean smell, but it couldn't mask the underlying odor of decay, of a life slowly, inexorably winding down. After a sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with Thorne, the $5 million offer felt like a ghost haunting her tiny apartment, a constant, aching reminder of the devil's bargain she had refused. Eleanor was in her favorite armchair, a faded chintz monstrosity that had been in their family for generations. A knitted afghan was draped over her legs, her hands, gnarled and thin, resting on top of it. The vibrant, fiercely independent woman who had raised Clara after her parents' death in a car crash was mostly gone, replaced by a frail figure adrift on a fog of pain and confusion. The disease had stolen her mobility, her dexterity, and increasingly, her memories. Clara knelt by the chair and took her grandmother's cool, papery hand. "Hi, Gram," she whispered, her throat tight. "It's me." Eleanor's eyes, a pale, cloudy blue, fluttered open. For a moment, a spark of the old lucidity returned. A faint smile touched her lips. "Clara, my girl, you look tired. Just long hours, Gram." It was the lie she always told. "Did you ever find them?" Eleanor murmured, her voice distant, her thoughts already beginning to drift. "Your grandfather's papers, the ones in the tin box. He said they were important. He said they were proof." Clara's heart seized. It was a fragment of a memory her grandmother had repeated a few times over the years, a story Clara had always dismissed as part of her confusion. Her grandfather, a foreman at the old Chempro plant, had died of a sudden, aggressive lung cancer when Clara was just a baby. Eleanor had never spoken of it in detail, only that he had been worried about something at the plant, that he had been collecting documents. But just as quickly as it surfaced, the memory was gone. Eleanor's eyes unfocused, and she slipped back into the quiet, inaccessible world she now mostly inhabited. Clara sat on the floor beside her for hours, the conflict raging inside her. $5 million. It was poison, but it was also the antidote. It meant the best care for Eleanor, a team of specialists who wouldn't just dismiss her as a lost cause. It meant a future for herself, a return to the path she'd been forced to abandon. She could become a doctor. She could dedicate her life to fighting for communities like Northwood, for people like Eleanor. But accepting it felt like a profound betrayal of her grandfather's memory, of the proof he had died trying to protect. It felt like signing a non-disclosure agreement with the devil, taking a payoff to absolve Elias Vance of his company's sins, and putting a price tag on her grandmother's suffering. Meanwhile, in a sterile, sun-drenched suite at Mount Sinai, the gears of the Vance Empire were grinding on, unimpeded by the mortality of their leader. Elias was awake, propped up against a mountain of pillows, a web of monitors tracking the fragile rhythm of his newly repaired heart. His near-death experience had stripped him of his usual armor of command, leaving him looking older, grayer, and more vulnerable than any photograph had ever captured. Standing by his bed was not a concerned family member, but his son-in-law, Julian Croft. Julian possessed all of Elias's ambition, but none of his substance. He saw his father-in-law's sudden fragility not as a tragedy, but as a power vacuum waiting to be filled. "The board is rattled, Elias," Julian said, his voice a smooth cocktail of synthetic concern. The stock dropped 12 points at the opening bell. The investors see this as a moment of instability. They need reassurance. Elias's gaze was sharp. "The stock will recover. Focus on the quarterly reports, Julian, not the palace intrigue." "It's more than that," Julian pressed a little too eagerly. "This Waitress situation. The media is turning her into some kind of folk hero. It makes the company, and by extension you, look weak, dependent." He paused. "Marcus told me she refused your offer. An incredible, generous offer. See? It makes her look like a saint, and you look like you have something to hide. It's a bad narrative." Elias's silence was his only reply. He had been stunned by the girl's refusal, but even more so by her accusation. Chempro Solutions. Northwood. The names were ghosts from a past acquisition, a file buried in a mountain of paperwork from a quarter-century ago. He had dismissed it as a desperate ploy, a shakedown. But her fury, it had felt real. "My PR team has a strategy," Julian continued, sensing the opening. "We leak a story, something to taint her. Perhaps she has a criminal record, a drug problem, or maybe she's an opportunist who has attempted this sort of thing before. We discredit the witness. It's simple reputation management. We control the story before it controls us." Elias's eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. "She is the woman who saved my life, Julian. She is not a public relations problem to be managed. You will leave her alone. That is an order." The command was absolute, but Julian merely gave a placating nod, his mind already spinning. His father-in-law was weak, sentimental. This Waitress was a loose end, a complication in his own carefully laid plans for the future of Vance Industries. The piercing, monotonous scream of the alarm was a sound from another world, a digital shriek of pure panic that sliced through the thick, suffocating silence of the hospital room. It was the sound of a system failing, of a body declaring war on itself. For the second time in less than a week, Clara was at the epicenter of Elias Vance's mortality. The nurse who had burst in was a flurry of motion, shouting codes into a phone, her professional calm shattered. Marcus Thorne stood frozen, the damning papers fluttering from his grasp to the floor, his face the color of old parchment. But Clara moved. There was no conscious thought, no debate between healer and victim. The rage and grief that had been a pillar of fire in her chest moments before were instantly doused by a cold, clinical flood of adrenaline. Her body, trained by textbooks and instinct, knew the calculus of dying. She saw not the architect of her family's ruin, but a collapsing system, a chaotic electrical rhythm firing in the ventricles, a pump failing, oxygen-starved brain cells beginning their silent, irreversible cascade toward death. "He's in VTAC. It's going to degrade into VFib any second," she snapped, her voice cutting through the nurse's frantic call. "Get the crash cart, now!" Her command galvanized the room. The nurse, startled into action by Clara's sheer authority, repeated the order into the phone with renewed urgency. Clara was already at the bedside, lowering the head of the bed, her hands moving with an eerie, practiced calm. She glanced at the telemetry monitor, her eyes scanning the jagged, chaotic spikes that represented Elias's heart tearing itself apart. The rhythm was unsustainably fast, a hummingbird's frantic beat in the chest of a dying man. "Mr. Vance, Elias, can you hear me?" she said, her voice loud and clear, leaning close to his ear. His eyes were wide, glassy with terror, his skin taking on a waxy, cyanotic pallor. He was conscious for now, trapped inside the storm. A swarm of medical personnel descended upon the room, a blue-clad whirlwind of controlled chaos. The crash cart rattled in, its metallic drawers and red plastic containers a promise of both violence and salvation. A resident, young and sweating, was barking orders. "Start a second IV line. Get me 150 of amiodarone." "Pads on," another nurse commanded. Clara stepped back, Her role as first responder usurped by the hospital's army. But she didn't retreat. She stood her ground, a silent, gray-hoodied sentinel, watching their every move. She saw the resident's hands tremble slightly as he drew up the medication. She saw the nurse place the defibrillator pad slightly too high on Elias's chest. "Lower," Clara said, her voice quiet but caring. "The apical pad needs to be on the mid-axillary line." The nurse shot her a furious, confused look. But the attending physician, who had just arrived, glanced from the monitor to the pads to Clara's fiercely focused face. He gave his nurse a sharp nod. "Do it. Move the pad." They were losing him. The chaotic rhythm on the screen began to decay, the sharp peaks dissolving into the finer, more sinister quivering of ventricular fibrillation. His heart was no longer beating. It was just shuddering, a useless bag of muscle. His eyes rolled back. "He's arrested! Charging to 200! The attending physician yelled. "Everybody clear!" The high-pitched whine filled the room, a sound now seared into Clara's memory. The convulsive arch of Elias's body, the fall, the pause, the resident's fingers on his carotid artery, then a grim shake of the head. "No pulse, resuming compressions." As the resident began the brutal, rhythmic work, Clara felt a strange, chilling detachment. She was watching a mirror image of what she had done at the gala, but the context was now impossibly, grotesquely twisted. The first time, she had fought to save a stranger. Now she was a spectator to a desperate battle to save the man who embodied a generational curse upon her family, a man whose life was tethered to a truth so poisonous it had literally broken his heart. The papers lay scattered on the floor around Marcus Thorne's feet. The internal memo, the NDA, her grandfather's death certificate. They were artifacts of a slow corporate murder, and the victim's own body, decades later, was now the final piece of evidence. "Charging again. Clear." Another shock. This time, as Elias's body fell back, the monitor flickered. The chaotic scrawl of V-fib wavered, then resolved into something recognizable. A beat. Another. Slow, but organized. A sinus rhythm. A collective sigh of relief filled the room. The attending physician nodded, his face grim. "We have a rhythm. Let's get him prepped for the cath lab now. He's throwing clots." As the team worked, packaging their patient for transport, the attending physician walked over to Clara. He was an older man with tired, intelligent eyes. He had seen her correction of the pad placement. He had seen the look on her face. "You're the young woman from the Met, aren't you?" he asked. Clara could only nod, her throat thick with unshed tears of rage and exhaustion. "Your instincts are flawless," he said, his voice low. "You should be in medical school, not just visiting hospitals." He paused, his gaze dropping to the damning papers on the floor, then back to her. "Whatever this is, I hope you know how remarkable you are." He then turned and followed his patient, leaving Clara alone with Marcus Thorne in the suddenly cavernous, silent room. Thorne, his composure finally and completely shattered, sank into a visitor's chair. He looked at Clara, his lawyerly armor gone, leaving only a weary, horrified man. "In 30 years of representing him," Thorne whispered, his voice hoarse, "I have seen him destroy competitors, stare down governments, bend markets to his will. I have never, ever seen him look broken, until he read that memo." He gestured to the scattered papers. This changes everything." Clara knelt and began to gather the documents, her movements slow and deliberate. The flimsy, yellowed paper felt impossibly heavy in her hands. This was her grandfather's ghost. It was the proof Eleanor had rambled about in her moments of lucidity. It wasn't just a corporate malfeasance. It was a story of a good man trying to do the right thing and being crushed by a system that valued profit over life. Elias Vance hadn't created that system, but he had perfected it, benefited from it, and built his empire upon its dark, amoral foundations. "Yes, it does," Clara said, her voice cold and clear as ice. She stacked the papers into a neat pile. "And it's mine now." 3 days passed in a strange, suspended quiet. The media storm had reignited, fueled by rumors of a second health crisis, but the hospital, a fortress of HIPAA regulations, was impenetrable. Clara returned to her apartment, the original Chempro files tucked away in a fireproof box she'd bought at a hardware store. She had the weapon now, the incontrovertible proof. She could go to the press. She could file the lawsuit of the century. She could destroy Elias Vance and everything he had ever built. But the thought of it left her feeling hollow. Destruction felt like an ending, not a solution. Her goal wasn't to punish one old sick man. It was to honor the dead and fight for the living. It was to find a way to transmute her righteous anger into something that could heal. On the fourth day, Marcus Thorne called. His voice was different, devoid of its usual professional varnish, replaced by a deep, human weariness. "He is asking to see you," Thorne said simply. "He's weak, but he's lucid. He is refusing to speak to his board, to his family, even to his son-in-law. He will only speak to you." Clara found Elias in a different room, a quieter one in a step-down unit. The forest of machines had been thinned to a few essential monitors. The view of Central Park was gone, replaced by a simple brick wall. He looked smaller, diminished. The titanic force of his personality leached away, leaving a frail, elderly man tangled in tubes and blankets. His stormy eyes, when they met hers, held no fight. They held only the vast, desolate landscape of defeat. He gestured to the chair by his bed. This time she sat. For a long time he said nothing. The only sound the soft, rhythmic puff of the oxygen concentrator. "Legacy," he finally rasped, the word a struggle. "A man spends his life building something he imagines will be his legacy, a monument of steel and glass and stock points. He thinks it will last forever." He took a shallow, rattling breath. Then he discovers the foundations are built on poison, on a dying man's signature. The entire structure is a lie. He looked at her, his gaze unflinching. "I did not know about your grandfather. I want you to believe that. But it is a worthless truth, because I should have known. My sin was not malice. It was indifference. A willful, arrogant, unforgivable indifference. And it is worse in a way. Malice requires passion. My crime was committed on a spreadsheet." Clara listened, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. This was not the apology she had expected. It was a confession, a self-evisceration. "Your son-in-law came to see me," she said, her tone flat, observational. "He offered to be my champion on the inside. He wanted me to help him take the company from you." A flicker of the old cold fire returned to Elias's eyes. "Julian," he said, the name tasting like ash. "He is the perfect product of the world I created. All of the ambition, none of the ballast." He looked away, a deep, shuddering sigh escaping him. Marcus has been investigating him. Julian was already making plans. He had contracted a crisis management firm to begin leaking a smear campaign against you the morning after the gala. He saw you not as a savior, but as a loose end. The confirmation of Julian's treachery barely registered. He was a symptom, not the disease. "I am removing him," Elias stated, his voice gaining a sliver of its old command. "From the board, from the company, from my will. My daughter will be displeased, but she chose him. She chose that life." He waved a dismissive hand, as if clearing away a lifetime of familial disappointment. "That is my mess to clean. It is not what I asked you here to discuss." He reached a trembling hand toward the bedside table, retrieving a single, thick folder. It was not the elegant leather portfolio Thorne had brought to her apartment. It was a simple, functional thing. He pushed it across the table toward her. "This is not an offer," he said, "and it is not a settlement. It is a proposal, a starting point for a penance." Clara opened it. It was not filled with trust, account details. It was filled with plans, charters for a new foundation, geological surveys of Northwood, blueprints for a state-of-the-art medical facility, a detailed multi-billion-dollar, multi-decade plan for the complete environmental remediation of the Chempro site and the surrounding aquifer, a lifetime care fund for every family in the Northwood cancer and neurological cluster, fully endowed, and a final page, a mission statement for a new research grant, the largest of its kind in the world, dedicated to studying the link between industrial pollutants and neurodegenerative diseases. It was to be called the Robert and Eleanor Thompson Legacy Foundation. Clara stared at the papers, her vision blurring. It was a staggering, monumental act of corporate atonement. It was more than she could ever have imagined. It was justice, written in the language he understood best. Capital, logistics, and overwhelming force. Why? She whispered, looking up at him. Why do all this? Elias Vance looked at the brick wall outside his window as if it were the most interesting view in the world. His voice was quiet, stripped of all artifice. Because you were right. I was dying alone in a room full of strangers, suffocated by the weight of my own life. You brought me back. Then you showed me what that life was actually built on, and it nearly killed me again. The universe doesn't give a man a third chance, Miss Thompson. He finally met her eyes again. I am not doing this to be forgiven. I don't deserve forgiveness. I am doing it because for the first time in 50 years, I need to build something that isn't a lie. I need my legacy to be more than just a balance sheet of my own damnation. He gestured to the folder. This foundation, it will need a conscience. It will need an independent oversight board. Someone with the moral authority to ensure its mission is never compromised. Someone who knows the human cost of indifference. He held her gaze. It needs you. It wasn't a job offer. It wasn't a payoff. It was a conscription, a transfer of power. He was giving her the keys to his atonement, asking his victim to become the guardian of his redemption. She saw the terrifying, beautiful, and profound symmetry of it all. Her grandfather had tried to sound the alarm from the inside and was silenced. Now she was being invited to stand on the battlements and hold the entire empire to account. She thought of Eleanor asleep in her chair, lost in the fog. She thought of the $5 million she had refused. This was worth so much more. This was a chance to build, not to break. Slowly, deliberately, Clara closed the folder and pulled it closer to her side of the table. All right, Mr. Vance, she said, her voice steady and sure, the voice of a doctor delivering a diagnosis, a prognosis, and a plan of care all at once. Let's get to work. Epilogue, 18 months later. The air in Northwood, Pennsylvania, for the first time in Clara's life, smelled of nothing but damp earth and autumn leaves. The monstrous, rusted skeleton of the old Chempro Solutions plant was gone, replaced by a sprawling construction site where the steel frame of a new building was rising against a crisp blue sky. A large sign at the entrance read, Future Home of the Thompson Center for Neurological and Environmental Health. Clara stood on a small hill overlooking the site, a thick medical textbook tucked under her arm. Her second year at Johns Hopkins was even more demanding than the first, but she drove down once a month for the foundation's board meetings. She was no longer a waitress, no longer a fugitive from her own life. She was a woman of purpose, her days filled with organic chemistry and board resolutions, her nights with studying and the quiet, steady hum of a future she was building with her own two hands. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus Thorne. He's asking for you. She found Elias not in a hospital, but in a small, understated cottage he'd had built on the edge of the remediation site. He spent most of his days here now, watching the earth movers slowly scrape away the poisoned soil of his past. He was in a wheelchair, a permanent consequence of the strokes he'd suffered after his second cardiac arrest. He was a ghost of his former self, physically, but his eyes were clearer than she'd ever seen them. He nodded toward a steaming mug on the table. Tea. She sat with him, and they watched the work in a comfortable silence. They rarely spoke of the past. Their work was their common language now. He was the founder, the funder, the penitent. She was the conscience, the guide, the living reminder of the stakes. The first cohort of the scholarship program started at the State University last month, she said quietly. 24 kids from Northwood, all their tuition covered. The first generation that might not have to leave. Elias nodded, a faint, fragile smile on his lips. Good, that's good. He turned to look at her, his expression serious. Julian, he tried to sue for his inheritance. The courts threw it out last week. He's in Europe now. A ghost. I'm sorry, Clara said, and she meant it. Don't be, Elias rasped. Some things must be excised for healing to begin. He looked back toward the construction site. My heart is failing, Clara. The doctors say I have months maybe, but it's a quiet sort of failure now. Not violent. He looked at his own hands, thin and mottled. It's strange. I spent my whole life fighting for more. More time, more power, more money. Now, I find myself at peace with having less, as long as what remains is true. Clara reached out and, for the first and only time, placed her hand over his. His skin was like paper. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, nor of affection. It was one of shared humanity, an acknowledgement of the profound and terrible journey that had bound them together. She had saved his life, and in doing so had forced him to reckon with his soul. He had poisoned her past, but in his act of radical atonement, he had given her the tools to build a new future for an entire town. They were not friends. They were not family. They were two people on opposite sides of a great crime who had found in the wreckage a way to build a monument not of power, but of grace. When the sun began to set, casting long shadows from the rising steel beams of the clinic, Clara stood to leave. She had a long drive back to Baltimore and an exam to study for. "Thank you, Elias," she said softly. He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon, watching as the first lights began to twinkle on in the town his company had almost erased. A town that was now, finally, beginning to heal.